Hey guys, thanks for tuning into the first episode of the podcast. A quick friendly reminder to give us a follow or subscribe on whatever platform you happen to be listening on. My first guest here today is our fine Vice Master, Robert Leach. We talk about a variety of topics, including Ormond, education, and the future of education, and what it's going to look like in a post-COVID world. Without further ado, I give you Rob Leach. So, Rob, you've had quite the journey through Ormond. You came here as an undergrad and now you're here as Vice Master. Could you give us a bit of a backstory? How did you wind up here at Ormond? What led you here and what led you back here?
Well, Josh, look, thanks for asking. I've had three incarnations in Ormond. I was here as an undergraduate for 2 years and I came back some years after that as a residential tutor for a couple of years. And then over the last 9 years, I've been back here as Vice Master. And it's been really interesting, three very different roles in the college, and all three of them more by accident than by design in many ways. My two elder brothers went to different colleges at Melbourne University, Whitley and International House, and so coming out of school I didn't really have Ormond on my horizon at all. I would have more likely gone to Whitley or International House, and it was just totally happenstance that one of my friends said, I'm going to apply for Ormond, and I sort of shrugged my shoulders and went, okay, I'll do that. So and I think I only got in, to be honest, because the master of the time, David Parker, liked rugby and rowing, and so I think I got in on those grounds rather than on any other abilities that I might have had. But anyway, I had 2 really good years in Ormond. We got great fun, and then I moved out into shared accommodation in Melbourne for a couple of years, which was also good fun. I really enjoyed my university years in a share house. Then I worked for a little while and then went to Oxford for 2 years and did PPE there. And was in Queen's College at Oxford, and that was also a fabulous couple of years. Came back to Melbourne, worked for a while in commerce, had 2 different jobs, one working for a company called IBIS, which is a management consultancy firm, and then working for the Australian Wheat Board, both of which were really good jobs. And the second time I came, after working in commerce for a couple of years, I decided I wanted to move into a different area, so I came back to do some further study. And I'd actually been verbally offered a job, tutoring at Trinity College next door. And I was about to accept it, and then I just thought, out of good manners, I should ring David Parker, the Ormond master, just to let him know. So I rang him up and said, yeah, David, I've been offered a job at Trinity and I'm just about to accept it, but I just thought I should let you know. And he said, well, we can't really have you going to Trinity. Come over to Ormond and we'll find something for you to do. So he didn't even have a role for me at the time, but I ended up tutoring in politics and philosophy and doing various other things in the college and was here for a couple of years, which was also a really good experience. I then moved into education, moved out of Ormond, moved into education and taught at secondary schools for nearly 20 years, which I really enjoyed. Taught a wide range of subjects from economics and legal studies through to literature and the classics, and really enjoyed coaching sport and taking outdoor ed programs. And then a friend of mine contacted me and she said, look, we're having a reunion, you've got to come along. And I initially said, no, I'm not going to come. Your reunions, they can be annoying. But anyway, she teased me about it and told me to, not to be so soft. And so eventually I came along, and on that night I had a good chat to Rufus Black, who was then the master of the college, and thought, Ormond's actually still a really interesting place. So I applied for a job here and landed here without actually Ormond having been on my horizon at that time at all. So 3 different times here and 3 different roles.
Well, thanks for that, Rob. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned it was by coincidence all 3 times, and I think that there's this interesting dichotomy that new students either arrive through some kind of remarkable coincidence or through some strong family ties, and either way it seems to produce great students for us on the other end. But getting back to this sort of the topic of education, I know we're going to talk about it more later on, and so I want to sort of follow up on something you mentioned to me before we started recording, which is that you felt like you weren't the best student. Now, it's sort of hard for me to believe that now that you're Dr. Rob Leach. Could you sort of take us through your journey there?
Josh, I'd have to say I bumbled my way through school. I wasn't a particularly good student. I had good fun in my last couple of years socially and played a lot of sport. So my memories of certainly my last couple of years of school were very fond. But I'm afraid that the same might not be said of my teachers, who probably don't remember me quite so fondly. Yeah, I was probably a bit of a pain in the neck at school and wasn't really focused on my study. Managed to sort of scrape into Melbourne University. And it took me a few years, several years really, to find my feet at university. I ended up getting decent grades and doing an honours degree here at Melbourne and then the second one at Oxford. But it took me a couple of years to work out how to learn. Really for me that was learning in my own time, studying books and those kinds of resources. Going to lectures never really worked for me. I couldn't concentrate well enough to take decent lecture notes. So I was probably in some ways an unconventional student on my journey through university, but eventually I managed to find a way of making it work for me.
Do you think that there's anything the system could have done to accommodate you, or do you think you were just destined to be an autodidact of some description?
Look, I don't know, Josh. I think I went to a good school and plenty of good teachers at it, and many of my friends did very well and loved the schooling, the classroom and the teaching that they received. So I think just maybe I was just a bit of a scatterbrain where my thoughts and attention were in other directions. I was always a very keen reader. I think what saved me and meant really more than actually my schooling, but managed to get me through secondary school into university, was that in my own time I was an avid reader. And so I learned a lot from reading books in my own time rather than from the work that I was supposed to be doing at school and mostly didn't do.
What kind of stuff were you reading?
It was really very random when I was at school. I would just pick up anything from Dick Francis thrillers, horse racing thrillers, through to books of non-fiction like The History of Shaka Zulu. I can remember being one of my favourite books when I was a kid. And then right the way through to classics, Thomas Hardy and sort of classic English literature texts. And it was very kind of eclectic, random, but luckily for me, I grew up in a family of people who were keen readers. So there were just lots and lots of books all around the house. And my brothers and sister, my mum and dad, everyone was reading. And so it was just a very normal thing to do. And as I said, very varied, from everything from very serious and heady non-fiction through to relatively frivolous fiction was always on offer.
I don't want to read into it too much, but what interested you about Shaka?
I think the Shaka Zulu book just totally captured my imagination. He was the most extraordinary leader and led the growth and expansion of the Zulu nation, and then ultimately was in battle with the British colonialists there. And he really brought to the Zulus methods that the Romans had used in their fighting tactics, so close formation fighting, using of a short stabbing weapon as opposed to a longer spear. And I believe he learned some of those strategies from Englishmen that he spent some time schooling with in his early years. But anyway, one way or another, it's just a fascinating story of a transformation of a nation and a really incredible leader. And I suppose for me as a boy growing up, it was just extraordinarily exotic reading about this happening in South Africa. Yeah.
I know some of the people I've followed in the past haven't been his biggest fans. Steven Pinker's name comes to mind. But, he also doesn't like Napoleon, and I'm a big fan of Napoleon, so,
I think, people who do really significant things like Napoleon and Shaka, they're not necessarily good people. Doesn't mean to say you can't be fascinated by them. And if you see how Napoleon treated his soldiers with complete abandon after being defeated in Africa, and how he just left tens of thousands of soldiers there to starve, and likewise fleeing from the Russian campaign and leaving his soldiers behind. So Napoleon did extraordinary things, but he was almost a psychopath, really, in his total disregard for the welfare of his soldiers.
Yeah, there's definitely some stuff to be said there. But I feel like I've derailed the conversation. Let's get back to education. So later on, we're going to talk about tertiary education and Ormond a little bit more. But before we move on to that, I want to ask you about secondary education. So having taught at the secondary level for many years, do you think students who attend private schools come out with a significant advantage over those who attend public schools? And what can our education system do to improve the quality of education at public schools? Or are the differences ultimately not that meaningful in the end?
Oh, there's a lot there, Josh. I think that the unevenness of secondary education in Australia is a real problem. At the best schools, the quality of the education is really very good and would stack up, strongly when compared to many systems around the world. But many other schools are poorly resourced, and the quality of the education there is compromised as a result. And it's not that there are not good teachers at many government schools. There are many excellent teachers at government schools, but they're not as well resourced as at many of the private schools. So the experience that students get is quite different. I think often that's to do with what's the support that is wrapped around the classroom, so that at private schools there's an awful lot of support to help students in their study, their preparation outside of the classroom, lots more guidance. And so that really supports the student on their journey through secondary school and obviously into university. And students at private schools get a lot more enrichment opportunities, so that there are far fuller programs in sport and drama, debating, and all sorts of other cultural areas which aren't available at government schools because the resources are simply not there. The teachers, in many cases, those government schools would love to put on the programs that are available at private schools, but they simply don't have the resources to allow them to do it. So, of course, there's good potential for students going to those government schools to join clubs and have rich and interesting lives outside of school, but not within the school itself. So it does lead to a real unevenness in the experience. There are studies that show that students that get into university from a government school will do well if they get into university, because they're often a little bit more self-organising and able to manage their study than students that come straight from private schools, where they've been more closely managed in their secondary schooling and often find a bit of a challenge adjusting to university. These are generalisations, but they are borne out by some research that shows that students coming into, say, Melbourne University from an elite private school to perhaps a less well-performing government school, there's roughly about a 10-point ATAR difference in their capacity. What that means is that a student with, say, 95 and a student with 85, the 95 from a private school, the 85 from a struggling government school, by the time they're in third year university, they'll be getting the same grades. And that gives you some indication of the unevenness of the schooling across Victoria.
So switching gears here to steal a phrase from Sam Harris, I wanted to ask, how do you think the students have changed over the course of your various positions at the college, and what differences have you noticed between the generations?
Yeah, look, Josh, I get asked that question a lot, and I think it's quite an interesting one, given I've got an experience of the college over many decades, and the world has changed a lot since I was here in the early 80s. And so are students different, and if so, in what ways? The first thing that I always observe is actually they're more alike than they are different. Ormond is lucky. It's brimful of smart, well-educated young people who are eager to do good things, and that was true when I was here as an undergraduate, and it's true now. One of the big differences is I think that your generation are actually much more socially aware than my generation was. You are much more conscious of what's going on out there in the world and the consequences, environmental, social, and so on. We were pretty oblivious to that, pretty ignorant. It was not that we weren't, well-meaning, but I think we were much more naive than your generation is. Possibly we were a little bit more independent in some ways. When we landed in Ormond, typically our parents didn't see us for the year, or saw very little of us anyway. And we had far fewer staff in the college at that time. So whilst there were terrific people, David Parker I mentioned, the Vice Master, then Hartley Mitchell was also outstanding. There were lots of really good people in the college back in the day, but there were far fewer of them. And so students got far less help academically, culturally, pastorally, in all those areas. You much more had to make your own way through. And there were some good parts to that. It meant that you had to nut out your own problems, and some bad parts to that, because then it meant that people didn't get support when they really needed it. And so far more people suffered as a consequence of that. So it's a classic example of where there are benefits about the model back in the day when you had to look after yourself much more. But there are also some real benefits in having a much fuller staff who are able to support students in a range of different ways now.
And what about the caliber of students?
Look, academically, probably, again, it's much the same, to be honest. I mean, the university's grown, Ormond's grown. There are more students going to university. But in the end, Ormond is still really lucky. All of our students are Melbourne University students, so everyone's got over the hurdle requirement of getting into Melbourne University, which means that students are quite smart, well educated, and sufficiently well organised to get into university. So I think broadly speaking, you'd say the cohort of students is much the same. Another real positive, I think your generation are much better at putting on events than my generation was. We had fun, we made fun in our own ways, but when I reflect upon the quality of the events that you and your college mates organise, from the cultural through to the social, like the parties, the smokos and so forth, you do a far better job than we ever did by so far. There's not even really a comparison. I think you're, as a generalisation, I think that you are much more socially competent when you're working in groups and getting up and public speaking and those sorts of generalised social skills. I actually think your generation are far more accomplished than was the average with my generation.
How do you think that's played out, the improvement in the quality of the events? Has it been a slow gaining of momentum over time and students building on what other students have done, a sort of slow evolution?
Yeah, look, I think it's mainly been an evolutionary process, but that the Students' Club is far busier now than it was back in the early 80s when I was here as an undergraduate. And the expectations of what the Students' Club would put on are much, much higher. And that's evolved slowly and steadily over time. And the expectations are combinations of what students themselves expect from a quality event. They're also the community's expectations of how well a run event should be, a responsible serving of alcohol and similar sorts of things that are expected now and are just the norm at a student event, which really didn't exist back in the 1980s when I was here. The college as a whole is much busier. There are more programs, more things on offer in the evenings and at weekends than there were decades ago. That's been a slow and steady evolution, and I think the college is in fact a much richer and more interesting place in many ways than it was, which is not to say, as I said earlier, I had a fantastic time. It was great fun, but I do think there's much more on offer in college now than there was 40 years ago.
Well, thank you for that, Rob. That's really interesting, and it wasn't necessarily the answer that I was expecting to get. What kind of impact do you think the master has on the culture of the college and the experience?
Oh, look, I think the head of any organisation has a big influence on the culture of the organisation, and it's particularly true in educational institutions and a residential college like Ormond. I think the head of the college has a big influence. David Parker was a very dignified man, and he had the capacity, and this is almost a cliche when you describe it, but he had the capacity to separate the person from the deed. He showed everybody deep respect. And that was particularly relevant to me as a scatterbrained 17-year-old in my first year at university, where I was bouncing off the walls and doing all sorts of crazy things. And he would often call me into his office and give me a talking to about the need for me to work out how to improve my manners. But he always did it in a way that meant that I felt respected as a person, even though I was being told that I needed to change my behaviour. And in that way, he created a strong sense of loyalty amongst my peer group, and certainly with me, because we knew that he was always on our side, always wanting to look after us, always hoping and expecting the best from us, but also not afraid to pull us into line if that's what we needed, which we understood. We were smart enough to realise in the sober light of day we often did need to be pulled back into line. Yes, I think his tenure as Master of Ormond was a time when the place was relatively calm, and so he provided a very quiet dignity, caring dignity while he was here. So I think Ormond's been lucky enough to have a lot of really good masters. I suppose the other two masters I know closely, Rufus Black, who really did a terrific job in developing the college in its modern form, introducing the graduate community, doing quite an extensive building program, and really set a central identity of the college as having a moral identity, that we needed to be very conscious of our responsibilities in the world and that started from here in Ormond, where we had to think hard about our behaviours as students and as staff, and that was really crucial to the identity of Ormond. I think we've been very lucky, after the strength of Rufus Black's mastership, we've been very lucky to get an equally capable master in Lara McKay. She has very different skills to Rufus, but nevertheless is in her own way steering the college, I think, in really positive directions. And it's been particularly useful or lucky for Ormond to have Lara in the chair during COVID, because that's required so many different aspects to be managed at a time. And one of the things that Lara does have is a wide spectrum of talents, which she's been able to bring to bear in steering Ormond through, I think, what can, without hyperbole, be described as its most challenging period in its history. The college, under the impact of COVID, is under more pressure than ever before.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I think it should definitely be placed in the top 3, but some others spring to mind. World War I, World War II, and I imagine the Depression was pretty bad.
Yeah, that's right, Josh. And you would have to go back and look. I think particularly the Depression, you'd have to look back at those times and examine closely what sorts of pressure the college was under. But it's absolutely clear that the economic impact of COVID has really put the college in a very, very vulnerable situation. I think we're all confident now that we will steer our way through it and come out the other side in the longer term as a better college in several ways. But getting these settings right, and that's really about the fact that with COVID has made a huge reduction in the college's income, and therefore trying to keep the college financially viable so that we can open and thrive in the future, it has been incredibly difficult. But as I said, I'm confident that the right things have been done and that we can be sensibly optimistic about the college opening. And we don't know when, because the actual date's going to be determined by the progress of COVID and what governments recommend and so on. But nevertheless, we will be open and good for business at some stage in the future.
Well, that is certainly good to hear. So I'm wondering, has the college ever really been particularly prosperous, or have we always sort of been a bit strapped for cash moving from year to year?
That's right. I think colleges look like big grand places because we've got these magnificent buildings and beautiful gardens, and so we look like we should be a very kind of rich institution with tons of money in the bank. But the truth is that colleges are incredibly expensive to run. The student fees are quite considerable, but the actual costs of running a college are so high that they're very hard places to make a decent margin on. And we're a not-for-profit. It's what margin we make goes back into the college. It doesn't go to shareholders or owners in any particular way. But nevertheless, it's very hard to make a decent surplus, even notwithstanding the impact of things like COVID. So the college has always been pretty modest economically, even though I said it looks like a grand place, because we were lucky enough that Francis Ormond, all those 140 years ago, gave a large bequest in order to be able to build a really, really magnificent main building. So yes, I think you're right. Colleges have always been difficult places to run, and have always had to manage their economics very carefully in order to be sustainable in the long term. So I think I mentioned before that I think the college will ultimately come through COVID and be a better place in many ways. And what I mean by that is that as we've all been forced to upskill in the digital space, and so all of us from management through to the educators have had to think really hard about how we can present online material and how we might develop our programs. What that's going to mean is that when the college comes back and students are here, we'll actually be able to have the best of both worlds, where we'll be able to have the rich and really valuable face-to-face experience that is the best part of college experience. No one is ever going to question that. But we can then marry that with good quality digital offerings, and so we can have the best of both worlds. And educationally, we can really start to expand our offerings, and that'll help some students. For example, non-resident students might actually get real value out of tutorials being live here in a tute room, but possibly broadcast live via Zoom. And so students that might live a long way away will be able to come into the tutes virtually. So educationally, I think we're going to become a better organisation as a product of the experience of what COVID has forced us to do. It also means there's potential for us to move into that space carefully and thoughtfully, but as offering, making offerings to people outside of our immediate students. Conceivably we could start to develop a commercial offering of educational programs that we offer online to non-Ormond students, and that could be a really interesting thing for us to develop educationally, and also have the potential to develop in the long term a new revenue source for the college.
Yeah, okay. So this seems to be a fairly natural place for us to transition to talking about online education. So we're now in a situation where we have access to virtually the entirety of human knowledge. It's just one Google search away, except for some unique instances where the information may be classified, or it's hidden away in some academic journal that the average person doesn't have access to. And from having access to all of this information, I think we've really come to appreciate what education means, because I think we find that very few people have the ability to sift through that information and actually learn from it. And so I guess my question is, how can we best present information, and how do we do that in an online setting in a compelling and meaningful way?
Look, Josh, I think to take your first point first, I think more practically speaking, all information is available to us out there on the internet, and obviously there might be some small classified areas that we can't get into, but really, if you wanted to build a nuclear power station, you could probably get the information you needed from the internet. I forget who it was, but someone once made the observation that information isn't knowledge, and knowledge isn't wisdom. So there's a process from where that information is through to us as individuals understanding it and being able to work with it productively, and then also being able to apply sort of higher reasoning to it, so we can start to make some broader decisions which may have ethical elements to them, and so our knowledge becomes wisdom. And so that's really where I think education can step in, and that we can use our pedagogy, our teaching methods to help students of all ages, right the way from primary school through secondary, tertiary, into people who are wanting to learn beyond their university years. So good teaching is what's important in that space. Now that's partly getting the handle of the technology. There's fantastic potential in the technology, but getting more skilled at using that, so that what's being delivered is not simply a recorded online lecture, and therefore often relatively poor quality in terms of sound and the visuals, but actually developing that into really high quality. That's available, but it's very uneven around the world. But the advent of COVID has pushed so many people into online education that actually that's going to be a rapidly growing area where the quality of what's offered will escalate. And that'll be really good for students of all ages and all stages of their education. Then there's the need for then the teachers who are going to be delivering that to skill up, so that they can actually present the information in a way that students can learn, setting exercises that help develop that learning, creating feedback cycles so that students are able to understand their own development and know what areas they've got to work on and what areas they're strong in. And again, that already exists, but what we're seeing is a rapid accelerating of the development of that aspect of education online, and that's all going to be good in the long term. I feel optimistic for Ormond, because what it means is that the potential for us to really get maximum value out of the face-to-face experience, the what I sometimes call place-based small group face-to-face learning, sitting around in a tute room in a place that with people that and arguing ideas, and that's often the richest and the most powerfully developmental aspect of living in college. And it's not always in a tute room. In fact, it's often in the dining hall, sitting around the table at breakfast time, perhaps arguing over a story that you've all read in the morning papers, or similarly at lunchtime. As we develop better online tools, students are going to need to go less and less to their lectures. Melbourne Uni, obviously, it'll recover from COVID, but many courses will stay predominantly online, because why use a lecture theatre when people are getting used to looking at the lectures online, and as the quality of them improves, it'll be to the student's advantage that you can watch television quality lectures And they'll be able to marry that with hyperlinks that'll take you to places. Hypothetically, you could be watching a lecture on anatomy, and then you could then look at a YouTube film clip of some dissection or some sort of arthroscopic device looking inside someone's knee, perhaps. And so you, as a student, get the value of the lecture, and then some film and some other ways of supporting your learning. And then also the feedback can be really good, so that this is most obviously the case in subjects like mathematics, where you can be doing a test that evolves over the course of you doing the test. So if you're doing well, it can ask you progressively harder and harder questions, or if you're not doing so well, it can ask you progressively easier questions, or questions that are at your level. And that way, you as a student are getting immediate feedback onto what you're succeeding at and what you're failing at, and that can really benefit the learning cycle. Instead of doing a test and then getting the results a week later, or sometimes even longer, by which time your thinking has really moved on, and so the test doesn't really work as any meaningful feedback to you. It's really just an evaluation of that moment in time. Whereas if you're doing a test and it's giving you feedback in real time as to when you're getting things right, getting them wrong, and testing you at an appropriate level, from a learning point of view, that's just got fantastic potential. And these have been developed in maths, but the challenge would be to develop them in other areas. It's not impossible, but more challenging to develop them in the subjects that are not so much maths based.
Yeah, if I could just quickly interject here. Yeah, there was this interesting offline analog for maths that was essentially this text you would get that accompanied the actual textbook that had the work solutions for every question in the book. And I personally found that extremely helpful because, if you got stuck on a question, you could just go in there, you could look up the question, and you could see the process, you could see the steps, how they were laid out. And you almost certainly understood at that point, like 95% of the time, what was going on and what you needed to do in that particular situation. And you could figure out the theoretical reasons behind why you were doing that as well, and why that made sense as a process once you had seen the step-by-step working out. And that was extremely helpful, because if you can only ask your math teacher questions 2 or 3 times a week, then that's a huge latency effect that's totally unnecessary.
Absolutely. So, there's potential. It's harder to develop these kinds of methods in areas outside of maths, as I indicated, but it is not inconceivable. If you look at how some of the law aptitude tests are organised, where there's a passage of dense text and then some questions which are constructed as multiple choice questions, then you can see how you could easily adapt that to being online, where you read a passage, you then answer the multiple choice questions, and it tells you immediately whether you've got them right or wrong. And so you're getting feedback in real time as to your comprehension of that piece of text and your capacity to answer a question in response to that text. As I said, there's a huge amount of work in developing these, but the potential is very, very rich, and the opportunity for students in the long term will be really good.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine the potential there for that technology. There was something else you mentioned to me that was like a highly produced lecture as something else that was being developed, and you would essentially have actors deliver the information of the lectures and have computer generated imagery. Could you tell us more about that? What exactly was that?
Yeah, so what I was suggesting, Josh, is that in your generic undergraduate subjects, in your main faculty areas, they're very much the same the world over. You talk about chemistry 101 or economics 101. They might vary a little bit from university to university, but they're essentially the same in terms of their substance. And so really you don't necessarily need an academic presenting those lectures. You need a good actor who knows their lines, and you need to give them good material. And then you could film that with really first class lighting and sound, so that for the student they're watching something that's really high quality, presented by someone with really engaging presentation skills. And the content then is then provided by a university and might be offered for a fee. And so therefore there would be no real sense in you going to your lecture. You may as well watch it online. You can stop it, you can replay bits, you can go off and get a cup of coffee and come back and watch it. And there's real value in that. Now that means that a company that produces such lectures could then sell them all around the world. and it doesn't matter whether you're at MIT or Stanford or Melbourne University or at some a college in some obscure part of the world, you could be watching really first-class academic lectures presented to you online. And what that potentially frees you up then is to then spend other time in small groups, in conversation, and enjoying and using that as your opportunity to develop your discussion and exploring the ideas at depth.
Yeah, I think this is a good idea. I think the closest thing that I've seen to this right now is the great courses produced by the teaching company. Is that sort of along the lines of?
That's right. So there's already been a move, in this direction, and that's been happening for many years now. And it really is just that the quality is very variable, and some of it relatively poor in terms of the audio-visual parts to it, which means that even if the substance is interesting, it can be hard to really engage in it for any length of time. Now, I've studied quite a few courses, and certainly when I've been particularly interested in a text, several years ago, I got really focused on Moby Dick and spent a lot of time studying Moby Dick, and I looked at some of the great courses on that, and some of them were very informative and really good value, but others of them were actually relatively poor quality. But what COVID's done by forcing so many people all around the world to shift onto online means that people are skilling up, expectations are higher, the overall quality of online delivery is being rapidly accelerated as a product of COVID.
Yeah, I think that's good. It's good that the quality is increasing, but I have another major concern with online education, and that isn't necessarily the fault of online education, but it is a reality that has to be dealt with. My generation is very much growing up in this era of social media, and the reality is Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, they're all only one tab away, and whenever you're doing anything, on your computer, it's very easy to get distracted, and those companies are trying to distract you. Those platforms are trying to distract you. They're trying to increase your time on their website. And then, of course, if you're a gamer, there's a whole suite of social media that accompanies that as well. And it's increasingly difficult to just be able to sit down at a computer and maintain your attention, because all of those things are going to provide you more instantaneous dopamine than sitting down and studying are. So I guess the question is, Rob, how do we make education sexier?
Yeah, look, all of what you're saying is very true, and I've got 2 teenage sons who are at home as we speak. They're nominally going through their schooling, but as you say, inevitably spending a fair bit of their time on social media or playing games. And these media offerings are incredibly addictive. And so I do see my boys being consumed with their computer games. I'm not overly pessimistic. I do have some concerns about the amount of time that can be spent on these computer games, but work itself will become increasingly gamified, if I can use an ugly word like that, so that increasingly work will be done in virtual ways using some sort of control panel. And so a lot of the skills that you're learning whilst you're playing computer games will actually be directly applicable in the workplace. I mean, I know, for example, a good friend of mine who's a professor of cardiology, he does a huge amount of his surgery with the remote devices, and he needs, the dexterity and the skills of manipulating the devices, looking on a screen where the actual instrument he's using he's totally disconnected from. It's being manipulated remotely. So it's happening right now. It happens in mines, in manufacturing, in all sorts of areas. And that's only going to increase. So I'm not sure I have a quick answer for you, Josh. I think your generation will inevitably adapt as human beings. Just the most extraordinarily adaptable animal. It doesn't mean to say it will be without its consequences. I think some of them are, the physical health consequences of spending even more time in a sedentary position behind a computer is clearly not good for us, and yet the way in which our life of study, and then the world of work is going is we're increasingly spending hours and hours hunched over a computer screen, and that's just definitely not good for us physically.
Thank you all for tuning in for the first episode of the podcast. I hope you were able to put up with, me sort of easing my way into this. It's a learning experience, so I hope you can all appreciate that, the quality of the interviewing will get better over time. And just another quick friendly reminder to give us a subscribe or a follow, depending on, what platform you're on. There'll also be links in the description to the various other platforms. And once again, thank you for listening, and stay tuned for more coming soon.